a conversation with the authors of the Naglieri General Ability Tests by MHS.
Hi, my name is Kim Lansdowne. I have been in gifted education as a teacher, a coordinator, a director, and I am currently on the faculty at Arizona State University teaching classes in testing and measurement.
Hi, Dina Brulles, and like Kim, I've been a coordinator and a director for gifted programs for large school districts, and I'm currently the Gifted Master's Program Coordinator at Arizona State University.
Hi, I'm Jack Naglieri. I started off as a school psychologist in the 70s, and I worked at Ohio State and at George Mason, and I'm retired, but still doing a little bit of work.
What kind of impact do the tools we use to identify students for gifted programs have on the trajectory of a student's life?
The assessments that we use to identify kids for these advanced learning programs, actually, really, without being overly dramatic, it really does change the trajectory of a child's life. It does. And from a very early time, having recognized that these kids have potential and putting them in programs that meet that potential can change everything.
What kind of challenges had you experienced around equitable gifted testing?
The three of us have worked together for probably 25 years, and during that whole time, we've seen the field continue to struggle identifying and serving these students. So we made it our goal to try to make a difference for these kids.
Dina and I have both been coordinators for large school districts in Arizona. And Arizona has a very diverse population. And what I found, and I know Dina did too, in our districts, is that we were really identifying very successfully the economically advantaged students, the kids that had a lot of resources. We were easily identifying those students using all different measures. But what we struggled with, and what the field has struggled with, and what we personally struggled with, really was identifying the kids that were economically disadvantaged and didn't have resources, and parents were working more than one job, and those were the kids that we really were focused on when we first talked about developing a new test.
I was a bilingual teacher, an ESL teacher, and I would see these kids being overlooked. And because I knew their culture and their language, I also knew they were very bright. And so there was a lot of personal commitment to this from both of us, because when we're coordinators, we're testing our students in multiple schools, and we're seeing these patterns that reflect what's going on in society and is continuing.
As a psychologist, I became dissatisfied with the tools that we use to measure ability, intelligence, when it comes to identifying these students. Pretty much from the beginning of my career in the mid-70s, I became more and more interested in how can we actually have equitable tests, or what would it take to make them? I got to the point of recognizing that what we needed to do was have tests that measure how well a student can think to solve a problem, and not test questions that require knowledge, because a person could be really smart but not very knowledgeable because they haven't had opportunity to learn. Tests that I'm most proud of in this context is the one that I've had the opportunity to make with my two co-authors here.
How did you begin to work on the Naglieri General Ability Tests together?
So Dina and I were coordinators in two very large school districts in Phoenix, Arizona. And so we went to Arlington, Virginia as coordinators, and we went with the purpose of really trying to find ways to identify our underrepresented populations. Jack was presenting, and so Dina and I went to see Jack's talk.
Jack planted the seed, I think, about, maybe 20 years ago. He said, there's got to be a way we can identify these kids in verbal and quantitative without using language. And several years later, he called us and says, okay, I've got a solution. We need to work on this together. And that's how the idea for the three tests, sprang.
And I remember there was some resistance from the both of you.
Yes, there was. We're like, that's not going to work. But it did. And then we were fortunate enough to fly to Toronto and meet everybody at MHS, and what an amazing team. And so having that, I think that was the final impetus that we went, okay, we can do this.
The Naglieri General Ability Tests measure what a student thinks rather than what they know. What does that mean exactly?
So traditionally, intelligence tests that have been used include knowledge. It's typical for an intelligence test to have a vocabulary subtest or a word analogy subtest. And of course, that demands knowledge as well as thinking. This creates a real problem for children who don't have opportunity to learn, or children who are learning English. And they come to school and they can be really, really smart. When they take that kind of a test, they're not going to show up as being smart enough because they haven't had the opportunity to learn. So this concept of measuring intelligence in a way that evaluates how well a child can solve a problem by thinking, and that test question doesn't require knowledge. That's the essence of what we did across these three domains of verbal, quantitative, and nonverbal. And those three descriptions are description of the test questions, not some kind of thinking. But in every case, the student needs to be able to think about the relationships of pictures that represent a verbal concept, or numbers to see patterns in the numbers, or shapes to see patterns in the shapes.
What we're saying, because like Jack said, it's the construct of the test item that makes it verbal, quantitative, or nonverbal. They're all avenues to measure general ability. So that's where we wanted to have all three, because we know that some kids are going to have strengths in some areas and not as much in other areas, but they're all, the ultimate goal is to identify students who have high potential. They're smart, they might not be highly achieving yet. These are not tests to identify students for advanced academic programs where they need to be accelerated. It's to measure who has that potential.
Tell us more about what the Naglieri General Ability Tests are comprised of. Please describe the verbal test.
When Jack asked me to work on the verbal test with him, we started thinking about if all the students spoke a different language, we would definitely need to take the words out of the test. So we're looking at conceptual understanding and how students can arrive at a solution based on these pictures that are presented and find relationships between those pictures.
When I read Luria's book, Language and Cognition, he talked about a technique called a superfluous fourth. And what that meant was Luria would say 4 words, and one of the words wouldn't go with the other 3. And I like that idea. I'd actually been thinking about it for a long time. And so what we really have created is a verbal test where each item describes something, some attribute. It could be as simple as every one of these has the color blue in it and this one doesn't, although we don't do that kind of an item, but that conceptually could be.
Tell us more about the nonverbal test.
So I've been writing items that are described as nonverbal measures of ability since the late 70s. And every time I create another edition, I always try to make it better than the previous one. So I created new ways to actually make matrices items. And we don't talk about it because we don't want people to try to prep kids by knowing different styles of the matrices and things like that. But they work. They're very powerful, just like the verbal and the quant. They're very powerful. They measure general ability in a way that's accessible to everyone.
Tell us more about the quantitative test.
It's not about math. It's not about addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. It's not about that. It's about reasoning in quantitative reasoning.
Oftentimes people ask us, what do you mean it doesn't measure academic knowledge? In the quantitative test, we wouldn't have a question that would be more easily answered because the student recognized a question that would demand knowing what Pascal's triangle is or any of those kind of mathematic facts, because that would be introducing knowledge into the equation of solving the problem. And the same thing is true with the verbal side. If you think about a traditional vocabulary test on a standard intelligence test, it starts off with high-frequency words, and then it goes down to low-frequency words. And the kind of words that the student doesn't hear very often makes it more difficult. We don't do that. It's clearly, when you look at all the items, it's not about the academic knowledge. It's about looking at relationships, whether it's numbers, pictures that represent verbal concepts, or just shapes, and figuring out what's the pattern. How do they go together, and why this one's not right, this one isn't, but this is the right one.
There's so much research that shows test anxiety in kids. The thousands of kids that I've tested in the past, you clearly can see, especially if they know they're coming in to be tested for a gifted program. And so this is just so user-friendly. It's just so easy for them to come in. It doesn't feel like a test. It feels more like a game that they're doing. And so we have reduced that level of test anxiety for every single kid that's taking this assessment.
Can you give an example of how cultural influence was carefully considered when creating test items?
Pertaining to the verbal test, what MHS did is they consulted with experts from different cultures. So we wanted to make sure that we removed as much cultural influence out of the test items, especially the verbal ones, because they're pictures. And so we want to make sure there wasn't offensive or uncertainty to any specific group. And so, for example, you won't see pictures with cows or pigs, or even dogs. We wanted to make sure that they could be answered regardless of the culture or the language that the child spoke. So there are those safeguards built in.
The Naglieri General Ability Tests have both local and national norms available. When would you use local or national norms in gifted testing?
Both have advantages for different reasons. So a national norm gives you the big picture, and when you have a school district that doesn't represent the U.S. population, it makes sense to do local norms.
What kind of administration support is available with the Naglieri General Ability Tests?
MHS provides onboarding support. Sometimes administering an online test is scary to somebody who hasn't done it before because they're very uncomfortable. And so the support has really helped launch these tests in a very positive and accepting way for the schools to try a new format for testing. They also help with the reporting out if you want to use local norms or if you want to use national norms, and then there's reports that are generated automatically.
Since the tests have launched, what kind of insights or feedback have you received?
All too often we have a gifted program that we love, and we've been doing it for 28 years, and it's working for certain kids. And so now all of a sudden we're identifying kids that are different from the ones we were identifying previously, so it means we have to alter, adjust, modify, change the way we're serving them. And that's okay, because I always say I would rather identify potential in a child and then decide how I'm going to best serve that child to help develop that potential. It might not be that it's developed yet, which is quite often the case with these kids that we're identifying on our tests.
Today, after my presentation, a person came up and said, "Thank you. I found 8 kids that I would have never have found."
Yeah, we hear that all the time.
And think about the difference that's going to make in that child's life,
yes,
and their education and the expectations that others have for them.
Yeah.
And their parents too, like their family. You know, their family life can change.
Invariably, somebody comes up to me and said, "I've tried that test and my teachers couldn't believe the kids we were identified," and they get really excited about it. I've never heard anybody say it didn't work for me. And so that's really rewarding.
For more information, visit storefront.mhs.com/collections/Naglieri-ability-tests or scan the QR code.